All right, we'll get started. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to this European Studies presentation and seminar with Stan Draenos and Milonas. Delighted to welcome all of you here. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct European Studies at the Wilson Center. And it's a great pleasure to chair the panel with two outstanding scholars, both of whom have, for a good number of years now, been involved off and on with the Wilson Center, and it's just great to be able to welcome them back. The subject today is a brand new book on Andreas Papandreou, The Making of a Greek Democrat and a Political Maverick, and we've got the author here, Stan Draenos, who will in just a few minutes talk about the book, and then we'll have comments by our distinguished co-panelist, Milonas from GW. Let me just say a couple of words about both of them and then turn the table over to them. So, political scientist and historian based in Athens, Greece, Stan received his PhD in political theory from York University in Toronto after having studied at University of California, Berkeley, and University of Chicago. He's been a research fellow with Princeton University's Hellenic Studies program and served as resident historian at the Papandreou Foundation in Athens. He's has had a number of stints here with us, a couple of presentations over the years, as well as affiliation as a contributing scholar with our Southeast Europe project a few years back when that project was still active. He wrote in the context of this fellowship, wrote an article on the United States foreign policy and the liberal awakening in Greek, 1958 to 1967. He's given talks and had a number of presentations at a variety of very distinguished institutions. I'll spare you the long list. But just to conclude that he has served as a media consultant to the Greek government and as an editor of 30 Days, Greece This Month. He has been a press secretary for the majority leader of the California State Senate, a speechwriter for government and corporate executives, as well as he's, I take it, been in the private business as well. And he, of course, is the author of the book we're featuring here today. I just told him I've not had the opportunity to read it from end to end, but just glimpsed into it, and it's a fascinating and extremely well-researched book, and we're all looking forward to your presentation. Stan will talk for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll switch over to our commentator, and I'll introduce Harris in just a moment. So, Stan.
Thank you, Mr. Osman, and thanks to the Wilson Center for inviting me, and for Milonas for coming to speak as well. I'll be very interested in hearing what Haris has to say. In 1964, Andreas Papandreou entered Greek politics like a bolt out of the blue, as a political rival put it at the time. 15 months later, Papandreou found himself fraudulently accused of heading a military conspiracy. A year after that, actual military conspirators imprisoned him along with 8,000 of his compatriots in a coup that saw him as its main target. In 1981, his sweeping electoral victory agitated American policymakers over his vow to close U.S. military bases. In 1989, he was indicted in a highly politicized parliamentary vote for alleged political corruption. Cleared of all wrongdoing in 1992, he trounced his opponents in elections the following year. Today, 16 years after his death, Papandreou is once more a controversial figure. The reasons are not hard to find. Greece's sovereign debt crisis has sparked anguished debate over how and why, after nearly 4 decades of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and democratic rule, Greece has ended up close to bankruptcy, with its economy in steep decline and its political system teetering on the edge. For much of this period, PASOK, the party Papandreou founded, has dominated the country's politics. That is until the crisis led to its virtual collapse in elections this year. It comes as no surprise, then, that controversy surrounds the Papandreou legacy. That legacy includes a substantial record of achievement. The generation over which Papandreou presided is now passing, but he is still remembered by many as the man who restored full political and social rights to those defeated in the Civil War, who fostered the emergence of a new, larger, and more cosmopolitan middle class, who established national health care, modernized an anachronistic educational system, and built a rudimentary welfare state, who shrank an outsized U.S. military presence in Greece, and who championed European Union equalization funds for Southern Europe, funds critical to modernizing Greece's economic infrastructure. Still, the present crisis has surfaced endemic weaknesses in the country's political, social, and economic affairs, giving Greeks little to celebrate about the achievements of their recent past, and much to scrutinize and bemoan about their failings. Let me state from the outset that my book does not cover Papandreou's years in power. It deals with his early formative years, years when he forged the change agenda that would define his subsequent career and in the process redefine Greece. In that context, I will attempt later to say something about the dynamics of this period and how they may help us gain our bearings on the crisis unfolding in Greece today. But first, a bit about the book. It begins with Papandreou's youth in Greece as the son of a prominent centrist politician. Following a bruising encounter with the Metaxas dictatorship, he emigrated to the United States in 1940. A graduate student at Harvard University during the war, he obtained a doctorate in economics. He then pursued a flourishing academic career that climaxed when he chaired the economics department at the University of California at Berkeley. As department chair in the late 50s, he put in a stellar performance, building the Berkeley department into one of the best in the country. Equally impressive was his success in healing the conflicts plaguing a faculty still divided following the university's MacArthur-era loyalty oath controversy. The bitter infighting at Berkeley replicated in microcosm the far more serious Cold War divisions he would find when he returned to Greece. Papandreou's achievements at Berkeley and his Harvard background served as his ticket into the American liberal establishment, which would enjoy unprecedented influence during John F. Kennedy's brief presidency. He enjoyed a rich set of connections with important figures in the new administration. Carl Kazin, who was Special Assistant on National Security for Kennedy, the renowned economist John Kenneth Galbraith, Walter Heller, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, and Arthur Schlesinger, Jr. Having outgrown the professorship, as he told a Berkeley colleague, Papandreou leapt into Greek politics on a wave of optimism generated by Kennedy's election in 1960. In Greece also, a liberal awakening was gathering steam under his father's leadership. A leading figure in George Papandreou's centrist government, Andreas advanced a modernizing agenda inspired by Kennedy's New Frontier. But he also took a controversial stance on the Cyprus question. His support for Makarios' struggle to forestall partition and to secure Cypriot independence as a non-aligned state earned Papandreou the enmity of officials at the Pentagon and the State Department. Their objective was to incorporate Cyprus into NATO in order to solidify America's strategic position against the Soviet Union in the Eastern Mediterranean. Ironically, Papandreou's independent stance was licensed by the advent of European détente inaugurated by Kennedy shortly before his assassination. Challenging both foreign and domestic elites, Papandreou became embroiled in a web of conflicts and intrigues. These conflicts threatened his reformist ambitions, but also created a growing following for his novel, socially progressive nationalist politics. While eventually his new politics would make him prime minister, their initial result was to make him the primary target of the pro-American military coup that seized power in 1967. Papandreou's formative years were critical to everything that followed. They were the years when he forged his persona as a demiurge who reconfigured the country's political landscape, as a tribune of the people who challenged the Cold War mentality dominating U.S. foreign policy, as well as Greece's domestic politics, as a charismatic leader who embodied the gospel of change that Greek voters would eventually embrace in overwhelming numbers. It was the period that gave birth to the Papandreou legend. That legend would sustain him through all the triumphs and failures of his stormy career, even as that career assumed a King Lear-like quality in his declining years. Political legends have their own truth and place in the life of a society, but for the biographer, they are first and foremost grist for the mill. After all, there is always more to events shrined in the legend than meets the eye. I saw Lincoln's, the film Lincoln last night, by the way, Spielberg's new film, which is a kind of good reminder of that, in some sense, obvious reality. Behind events enshrined in the legend lies a messier, more complicated story, as Spielberg points out. Close research for this book produced fresh perspectives on the lore surrounding Papandreou's works and days. I arrived at a deeper understanding of the motives, means, and objectives behind the U.S. Embassy's role in supporting George and Andreas, that's elder, the George the senior, and Andreas Papandreou's opponents. I discovered correspondence that documents the strategic thinking behind Papandreou's opposition to NATO plans for Cyprus. I found a hidden pattern in the use of the notorious Aspida affair to advance the coup plans of the Papadopoulos military conspirators. For those unfamiliar with Aspida, it was based on allegations later shown to be fabricated that Papandreou was the political leader of a Nasserite cabal within the Greek military. But aside from casting new light on the Papandreou legend, my research also surfaced important aspects of his politics that do not fit comfortably within that legend. Before he officially entered Greek politics, Papandreou used his influence with the Kennedy administration to prompt the king's decision to replace a right-wing appointee and install a neutral service government ahead of the 1963 elections. The king's surprise move evened the playing field with the right and helped pave the way for the Center Union's upset victory. To persuade U.S. policymakers to prompt the king's decision, Papandreou used his connections to a covert network based in Washington, headed by Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger. Thus, Papandreou knew whereof he spoke when he observed, a decade later, the fate of Greece is so intertwined with American politics that it is very hard to know what is Greek and what is American in Greek developments. It was exactly this perplexing aspect of the Greek-U.S. dependency relationship he would try to disentangle when he entered Greek politics on his own. This study emerged from 8 years of toil in archives across the United States and Europe, where I also interviewed dozens of Papandreou colleagues and collaborators, including Galbraith, Kazin, both of whom, and Leonid Hurwitz, all of whom now have passed, unfortunately. Dale Jorgensen, Clark Kruger, also has passed, and Andreas's political partner and spouse of 37 years, Margarita Papandreou. I should add that my stance in dealing with these sources was informed by personal experiences of Papandreou that I gained during an association that was particularly intense during his years of exile in Toronto in the 1970s. He was chair of York University's graduate program in economics. I was a political theory graduate student and a member of PAC, the resistance organization he created to fight the military junta. But let me also put in perspective the role that these personal experiences had in writing the book. The events it covers end with Papandreou's appearance at Princeton in December 1968, a year after his release from a Greek prison. My first personal encounter with Papandreou would take place in Toronto some 5 months later. Thus, my association began in the aftermath of the events documented in the book. Still, my experiences of him informed my writing in the following sense. my role largely as a member of his Toronto support staff, gave me a privileged position from which to observe him in action, teaching me much, but by no means everything, about his capabilities and weaknesses, about his way of dealing with people and situations, about his powerful, agile intellect, and finally, about the hopes and fears that drove his complex personality. I should perhaps also confess that in the years of far more distant association that followed, I found myself at points strongly at variance with his decisions and actions. Still, he remained for me a figure of massive proportions whose career deserved the serious treatment it had yet to receive. Let me close by returning to the issue of how the book may help us gain our bearings on the current Euro crisis, a crisis that, among other things, is a crisis in Greece's relations with Europe. Let me note that the book covers the period that is the natural starting point for historians seeking to understand the origins and causes of the crisis, at least as regards to its Greek component. And it is here, hopefully, that the book can contribute something of value as scholars scope out the task before them. What was that starting point? The event that put post-war Greece, at that point effectively a U.S. client state in the aftermath of World War II and Civil War, Marshall Plan, Truman Doctrine. The event that put post-war Greece on the path to Europe was Prime Minister Konstantin Karamanlis's 1959 decision to seek Greek membership in the common market. That decision was of fundamental strategic importance for Greece. It began to bear fruit with the signing of a Treaty of Association in June 1961. Another less notable event took place that same month. In June 1961 also, Andreas Papandreou's Center for Economic Research began operations in Athens. The center would be his vehicle for launching a political career in Greece. But in the eyes of its Rockefeller and Ford Foundation backers, the center was also intended to provide the expertise and know-how for advancing a broader American-led strategy for fighting communism through economic development abroad. In the Greek case, the objective was to relieve the United States of its post-war foreign aid burden by promoting self-sustained economic growth, while at the same time anchoring Greece within the West in the context of the Cold War division of Europe. That strategy, I should hasten to add, would turn out to be more difficult to implement than anticipated. The U.S. desire for Greek economic independence came into conflict with an American desire to maintain the political dependency of Greek political elites on their American patrons. This contradiction is what would spawn Papandreou's Maverick politics. In any case, Karamanlis's strategic decision to put Greece on the path to Europe played a critical role in Papandreou's initial foray into politics. An essential precondition for Greece's transition from economic dependency on the U.S. to self-sustaining growth was the settlement of its long-standing debts to pre-war bondholders. Those debts had denied Greece access to international bond markets ever since the country defaulted in 1932 during the Great Depression. After his visit to Kennedy in 1961, Prime Minister Karamanlis saw to settling up accounts with the U.S. investors who owned 20% of the defaulted bonds. In 1964, Andreas Papandreou, on behalf of his father's newly elected government, reached an agreement with the British bondholders who held most of the remaining 80% of the defaulted bonds. Greece's settlement with its pre-war creditors opened the doors once again to capital markets in Europe, enabling Papandreou to pursue international funding for his economic development plans. Unfortunately, these efforts were disrupted when King Constantine forced his father to resign in July 1965, an event that turned the country's politics upside down, setting Greece on the fateful path to the 1967 military coup. A broader issue links Karamanlis's European orientation and Papandreou's political debut. Those of you familiar with Papandreou's opposition to EU membership during the 70s may be surprised to learn that Karamanlis' strategic decision was in fact the platform from which Papandreou launched his 1964 run for parliament. Thus, Papandreou's inaugural campaign speech celebrated Greece's decision to pursue membership in the common market as a critical juncture in the country's history, as a cosmogonic event that presented Greece with the opportunity, indeed the necessity, to modernize an anachronistic economic, political, and social status quo. At the same time, Papandreou stressed the need for the people to elect visionary leadership if the country's efforts to emerge as a modern democracy were to have any chance of success. The elections took place, the Center Union won an overwhelming victory, and boldly confronting forces that represented a stultifying status quo, Papandreou would stake out the center-left politics that embodied his reformist change agenda. To be sure, Papandreou's stance on European association would undergo radical shifts over the coming years. Placing his reform program in the context of Greece's European prospect was the stake in the ground for establishing his center-left politics. But beginning in the first months of 1967, he began to express reservations about the impact that full membership would have on Greece's development efforts. In the 70s, he took an explicit stance against succession, seeing the European Union as a Trojan horse for monopoly capitalism. When he became prime minister in 1981, accession had already taken place. He accepted membership as a fait accompli, but sought to renegotiate some of its elements. Finally, in 1986, he led the charge successfully to secure regional equalization funds for Southern Europe. Understanding these policy shifts is an important item on my future research agenda, since the book ends in 1968. But it is not difficult to recognize the issue at stake in all of them. That issue was, what kind of relationship with Europe would enable post-war Greece, in the wake of civil war and military dictatorship, to advance its struggle to emerge as a modern European democracy? Another chapter in that torturous saga is perhaps what we are witnessing today. In writing his story from scratch, I've in some sense engaged in deconstructing the Papandreou legend. My hope was to put in its place a richer and more compelling narrative. I've tried to elucidate the high stakes and fierce struggles that, in all their disorderly reality, shaped, oriented, and propelled Papandreou's Maverick politics. My aim was to provide a more sober assessment of a controversial but consequential leader whose impact within Greece, but also within the European Union, would be enormous. It is up to the reader, of course, to decide how successful I have been. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Stan. We now have the privilege to have comments from really one of the rising stars in the field, Horace Milonas, who is assistant professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University. He's the author of The Politics of Nation Building, Making Co-Nationals, Refugees, and Minorities, published in, it's come out, but the official publication date is 2013. He's also an Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies, where he conducted research in 2008 and 2011 academic years. His research focuses on the processes of nation and state building, immigration, and the politicization of cultural differences. His book, The Politics of Nation Building, The Making of Co-National, Refugees, and Minorities, as just mentioned, come out with Cambridge University Press, identifies the conditions in which ruling political elites of a state target non-core groups with assimilationist policies instead of granting them minority rights or excluding them from the state. Only a political scientist can come up with a summary like that. His book, his second book project, tentatively entitled The Politics of Ethnic Migration, focuses on the policies that states develop either to attract and or to incorporate people returning to their country of origin, allegiance, or citizenship. His work has been widely published in leading journals in the field, not just in scholarly journals, but also in international newspapers and magazines. He teaches, as mentioned, at GW, courses on nationalism, nation building in the Balkans, and qualitative research methods, and it's just great to have him back here at the center.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for all of you coming here. I'm glad that Stan talked about the history and the content of the book so meticulously, so I can move beyond that, I think, to kind of suggest what are the implications, if you want, for political science and for our understanding of contemporary Greek society from your book. And I think there are many, and I think we should definitely discuss that, and I'm sure the Q&A will have a lot of that as well. I see a lot of eager people to jump into that. So I'll be brief. The book is not just a political biography. Not that the political biography would be a bad thing to be, but it's a novel for some. It's a political drama, meaning it's not a novel in the sense that it's not fiction. It's nonfiction, but it's written so well that actually I advise you all to read it. It's just really dramatic, the story. But also it's a history of the Cyprus issue for some that don't know about that part of the Cypriot question. It's definitely a history of Greece in the Cold War, definitely in the 60s. That's a very neglected period. We don't have really good histories of that period. And whatever we have, it's usually glossing over a lot of the details and the intricacies that are there. And I think Dr. Draenos is making a big contribution there. But also, I think, as I alluded to in the introduction, it's an important book that is ripe for political analysis and theory generation. As we heard, political scientists like to complicate things. We don't always try to simplify things. So I think that the biography is linked to at least 5 or 6 important broader issues in Greek politics, which are definitely, I think, and you will see how, related to the current crisis, which I would argue it's not a current crisis. It's a long crisis that just manifested itself in a financial or solvency crisis right now. And definitely a socio-political crisis. More and more we realize that. So the first theme I think that comes out of this book would be what could be called dynastic vestiges or dynastic remnants, if you want. So, or you could discuss the issues of nepotism or basically familial ties that have been very prominent in the Greek politics. I think all of you, when you're looking at this title, often they would tell me, what are you talking about on Monday? I said, oh, Papandreou's political biography. And I said, which one? So there are at least 3 prime ministers in the past century that Greece had that were called Papandreou, and they were all related, really closely related. So first theme that we can think about is how does nepotism function? What are its origins? What is the way that it's being reproduced? And that's something that many Greeks are thinking about in their efforts of regenerating the political system. How can you regenerate the political system just with the sons and daughters of pre-existing elites? So again, he does it with a twist because it's very clear from reading the book that Andreas is not just a son of George Papandreou. And that becomes really clear. But what is also important to think about is how is Andreas dealing with this? What are the obstacles that are in his way because of this connection? And to an extent, is his own radicalization in the 60s almost an attempt to overcome that very stigma? So from almost a psychoanalytical turn that the book takes in various parts, I think we get a lot of insights of these dynamics. And I think that's one way, the first way I think that the book can help us kind of grapple with the current situation and this system that is being reproduced, not just in Greece, of course. We have presidents that are sons and daughters of in other places, including this country. So the second theme I think that is fascinating and very important is what is discussed in the book as the American factor, and we're at the appropriate place to discuss that. But more generally, it's not just the American factor. I would say it's the theme could be external meddling in Greek affairs, but also in the affairs of smaller states. It's really material that somebody could use in order to understand what is the international relations of great powers and small states politics kind of thing, especially in a bipolar world, in a bipolar system. We have experts of the Cold War here with us, and it's not news to them, but I think we can learn a lot by reading the book and thinking about it, about what it means to have external meddling in some country. It's not as unidirectional as it sounds. Often, it's very convenient for us to just say, oh, the Soviets did this, or Russia is doing that, or the European Commission nowadays wants X. But it's never just that. The book shows it very well that Andreas himself was using the European factor, or the American factor, to get ahead when he needed them. And when he realized that he couldn't get ahead, it's quite stark in the book, when he realizes he cannot get ahead in Greece, especially with the Cyprus issue, which is the WWII issue, by being supported or using his connections, he keeps on using them when it comes to economics, but he has a clear break when it comes to the international or foreign affairs side of things. So again, the book allows us to problematize what is the very complex relationship between external intervention and external, let's say, interests, and internal subgroups that are trying to draw in different actors at different points in time whenever they see fit. And of course, being very explicitly against it when it's not to their benefit. It's not as simple as that, but I'm saying the book can invite a further probing of that type of line of thinking. The third issue, and of course the second issue, I don't need to tell you how many times external actors have been blamed for the contemporary situation in Greece. So I'll invite you to start thinking more complexly about which groups of the population are suggesting who is to blame and so forth. The third theme, which links very nicely to the second theme, I think, has to do with conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And you are all very aware that in our part of the world, and including the Middle East, but increasingly in the United States itself, surprisingly, I think, conspiracy theories are going, rampant. And that's an interesting development, and I have some hypotheses of why this is so. From the book, we can get some a theory generation again, when you have basically a government being caught lying about something or not revealing fully some information, and that breaks out in the news, or when you have a weak government, when you have weak institutions that have lost their credibility for whatever reasons, all of these type of things generate more and more conspiracy theories. Now, in the case of Greece, it's more complicated, as we see from the book, because often these conspiracy theories are not just conspiracy theories, there are conspiracies. I counted at least 4 coup d'etat attempts that were actually documented through the archives here in College Park and other places through internal documents, where the US embassy actually stopped coup attempts from happening because for whatever reasons, it's not part of the story now. But so in a way, I would invite people, when they're talking about conspiracy theories, to at least analytically distinguish between conspiracies that are possibly true and conspiracy theories that could border fiction or fantasy world, like aliens are coming down, or X leader is the incarnation of the devil, or what have you. The point that we get from this book is that we have at least enough evidence to say that a lot of these things that were presented as conspiracy theories by various groups at the time were actually conspiracies. When we nowadays listen to various actors generating conspiracy theories, we should always be sensitive to the history of the place, how many of those conspiracies have been proven to be actual conspiracies in the past. So when you tell someone, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, I won't listen to you, well, it's not going very well in some parts of the world because they have been told that before and have proven, these people have been proven wrong. So that's a third point. The fourth point has to do with nationalism and its usage, and that's kind of where I'm more of an expert in Greek politics at the time. And I think it shows, it's the first sign of how brilliant Andreas was in, as a politician to change basically the cleavage structure. When he came back after almost 20 years being in the US academia, basically, he wasn't in the US in a full sense, I would say. All of us were in the academic world. I've been in the US for 12 years. I don't consider myself having lived in the US, really, though, because US academia is very different from the US at large. So he was in the US academia, let's say, for almost 20 years. He realized very quickly that he hadn't lived through the occupation. He didn't fight with the Greek troops that were fighting the Albanian front that he should have if he was there, right? He didn't live through the Civil War. He didn't live through most of the most important events of the 20th century. He escaped in a way, in a fortunate manner almost for his life. So when he came back, he found pre-existing cleavages. And he decided that the way to make himself relevant and to, in a way, to cut the cord with his father, I guess, the familial tie accusation, was to create a new cleavage structure. And he did that brilliantly. If he was a political campaign manager, he couldn't have done it better. Actually, he was married to one, in a way. He was married to a public relations specialist. Margaret was one. But I'm sure it wasn't just her advice. It was definitely his brilliance in understanding how he can reshape the cleavage in a way that the anti-communist, anti-communist patriotic, communist anti-patriotic cleavage that existed when he entered Greek politics could be changed around into saying, actually, those are analytically distinct concepts. You can be an anti-communist and patriotic. You can be moderate towards communist and still be patriotic. You can be communist and be patriotic for all that he cared about. So with the Cyprus issue, he found the opportunity to do that more effectively. For the interest of time, I'll jump over to the fifth theme. We can talk at the Q&A more about this nationalism wedge issue. And that's where most people that are familiar in my generation with Andreas are familiar with his governing in the 1980s, of course. And that's where he gained his worst reputation for most of my compatriots, I guess, and where he became the most controversial, I think. And that's where people would put their fingers on the current crisis. And they would say, this is where everything bad about the Greek economy started. And to an extent, I think what Andreas did is, and the book, I think the origins of this are in the book, his experience with US politics, campaigning in the Stevenson campaign and campaigning and various other campaigns and being in the circle, in the broader circle of Kennedy's administration, gave him this understanding from US politics that the politician is not above the people. The politician has to be with the people and go into the coffee shops, go into the diners, go to Ben's Chili Bowl, take pictures with the people, all that. And Andreas realized that he couldn't do the old-style Greek politics, and he would change, even beside the cleavage structure, he would change the way politics is done. The other thing that he learned from here is that there are special interests in society. Now, the difference between the US and Greece is that the special interests in the US society are really big, and they're many, and they're multiple, and they balance each other, and they're very competitive with each other. Well, the difference in Greece was that in the 80s, those special interests were having dinner with the prime minister, and in the end, there was no competition. So although he transferred a lot of the things he learned from the US situation and experience, in Greece, a lot of these ideas kind of didn't work because there was no competition. Florida was not competing with California over X, big project on Capitol Hill. They were all competing at Andreas's dining table. And that's a very different type of competition for who you're going to dine with. And over time, you tend to develop patterns about who you dine with. You don't like to dine with different people every time because it's getting tiring. So that's another way that the book is relevant in showing us the origins of those experiences and how they shaped his understanding of doing politics. And of course, unintentionally, I would say, these micro motives of Andreas led to a macro behavior that may have, rightly so, as many people point out, have led to a state that was basically not developing anymore, but kind of creating a state, society, party nexus that was not very able to get out of that trap of electoral cycles and populism. The final one that I will close with is the vision. I think definitely Andreas had a vision, and he had really strong ideological ideas that he was not shy of putting forward. In the United States, that manifested itself primarily in his position with the non-aligned movement and Palestine and other issues, and their disagreement with this, I guess. But I will read, just to close, a paragraph that is not the most controversial paragraph of the last page of the book. And Andreas is talking to a group of academics in 1968, and he says, while there is time, the democratic progressive forces of the European continent should join hands to face the new gathering storm. They must work for a free, united, and peaceful Europe in which each nation is respected and as an equal partner, and each citizen respected by the state as an inviolable individual. When a united Europe emerges and masters its technological, economic, and political potential, it will be able to define its relationship with both the US and the Soviet Union in a way which may well contribute to peace, progress, and democracy in the world. That could have very well been the ending paragraph of an op-ed today at Washington Post, changing the Soviet Union part. So he definitely has changed his mind many times. That's made him very controversial. Circumstances swayed him in various ways. It's a brilliant book. I think it has a lot to say about the contemporary situation, but most importantly about the future. And if we learn one thing about Andreas through this book, it's definitely that he was thinking prospectively, not reactively. And that's where he won over the rest of the political establishment of Greece, that most of them were reactive, and he was proactive, and he was thinking ahead, creating the situations where he would find himself dominant or necessary, or absolutely necessary for its resolution. And thank you for the excellent book, and I'm waiting for the second volume, because the book stops at 1968, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Harris. Those were very thoughtful comments that I think launches nicely into, I hope, a conversation with all of you. If you could please, in Wilson Center tradition, wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you like. So we'll start over here and then work our way around the table.
My name is Stephen Shore. Neither of you mentioned Turkey, and it seems that one of the key problems about Greek nationalism is that it must face the fact that Turkey is of greater strategic, geopolitical strategic importance to the United States. Do you think that Papandreou fully grasped this fact?
How should we?
I think Nari should answer this question. Because
Well, I'll give it my best shot. I learned, basically that's giving me a good opportunity to put my finger on the period that Stan is identifying as the period where, or the moment even, that Andreas's predispositions towards the United States changed. And he can correct me if I'm wrong. So he's describing their trip with his father being prime minister to discuss basically the Athens plan about Cyprus in 1964, if I'm not mistaken. And basically he realizes that the US is using the threat that you were talking about at the time to force the Greek government into the negotiating table, possibly at Camp David or with the Turkish side, to reach an agreement that actually in the eyes of the Turkish government at the time was not looking good either, which was a military base with a lease of the territory or even some form of sovereignty of 100 square kilometers or 200 square kilometers. And that would take into account Turkey's security concerns, but it would also do the double enosis in a way that it was discussed at the time. Andreas thought, it seems, of that experience as unfair, not just, maybe even humiliating that they were kind of forced under that threat indirectly by the United States. The United States that he felt that he was very much a part of. Let me remind you, he joined the US Navy as a volunteer during World War II. He gained his citizenship through that type of route. He spent decades, basically a couple of decades, educating American individuals, right, that went ahead to become really important in various fields. Some of you might be, have been his students. So in that sense, I think he was bitter about it. And there is a back and forth with Margaret that you're mentioning, where he goes back and says, you know, I can't believe this, blah, blah. And Margaret says, well, what would you do if you were the American government? And it seems at that moment he turns to her and says, well, guess what, Margaret? I'm not the American government. So in a way, that's where it seems that he took some distance from a very clear, he had to get a very clear distance in order to, and another moment would be, well, we have many moments, I guess, but yeah. But that, for me, was a stark moment that has to do with this Turkish threat, if you want, and how it was used in the tripartite, it's not even tripartite. I did injustice to the conspiracy part, talking about actors. The palace was almost an independent actor at the time. The military was semi-independent under the palace, but also having direct links to external actors. So it's not as clean-cut, obviously, as we would like it to be. But Andreas expected the US to be kind of a different type of force, having his own idealism about the US and the Kennedy group, I guess. And he was disappointed, it seems. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gentleman over here.
Thank you very much. I'm Stakis Panagidis. I come from Cyprus. I may add Brazil, Cape Verde, and Bethesda, Maryland, but I cannot escape Cyprus, so I have to ask a question about Cyprus. First, a piece of information which relates to the relation of the father and son. My only brother was member of the Cyprus Parliament, the first Cyprus Parliament, Daphnis Panagidis. And during the discussion of the Hutchinson Plan, he and two of his colleagues visited George Papandreou, the father. And while they were talking to him, one of the aides came to Prime Minister George Papandreou and said something. And the father was heard saying, again, there he goes again, Andreas. So this may be an evidence of the note, as you mentioned. But my question is Cyprus and NATO. In retrospect, of course, we can draw all kinds of conclusions. Here is Greece, member of NATO, Turkey, member of NATO, two sovereign bases, British bases in Cyprus. Was it the objection because Makarios was the non-aligned? Was it more the objection to Cyprus in NATO or some relation there? If you can elaborate more on that from the evidence, thank you very much.
Could you just clarify what you mean, your question of it? I mean, when you say what was the problem, what was his problem? The U.S. problem, Makarios' problem?
No, Andreas objected in agreement with Makarios, somebody who was non-aligned. In retrospect, of course, we can say, I wish we accepted the Hutchinson Plan and any other plan and avoided the invasion of Turkey. But you suggested that that was part of the ideological side, or that it was an objection to a U.S. presence there, although Greece was part of NATO. And I mean,
well, Greece,
of course, in retrospect, we can criticize everything.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you had more evidence as to the reasons he objected.
That Andreas objected.
Andreas.
I mean, I think it's important to understand the American perspective on the issue, and you can find that, incidentally, in George Ball's memoirs. He was Johnson's special envoy on the question at this point. the past has a different pattern. There's a very revealing statement in those memoirs where George Bollocks explains that Cyprus was the U.S.'s problem was to keep Cyprus as part of NATO. Well, NATO, Cyprus was not part of NATO. I mean, there's sort of a misnomer, and it's still not. Yes. I mean, conditions, of course, and what NATO means, and all that has transformed radically. So we're talking about a period that has different points of reference. And of course, the Cold War is the main point of reference for the Cyprus issue. The U.S. concern was to keep the Soviet Union from making inroads into the Eastern Mediterranean, which is critical to the hydrocarbon resources in the Middle East and so on. It was also a major sort of listening post for the British. It was a British territory until 1960. That may still be true. But in any case, Andreas was hoping that it would serve better the interests of Hellenism, so to speak, if Cyprus remained independent rather than having the island divided, essentially, partitioned between Greece and Turkey, and incorporated into NATO. He based that hope on the emergence of détente and the possibility that would give Greece the chance to exercise some independence from the senior partners of the alliance on that issue. Matter of fact, that's the argument he made to Cyrus Sulzberger when he was interviewed about it in the 60s. But to go, what was the problem? The problem was that in order to accomplish the Atchison plan, it would mean overthrowing the government of Cyprus. It would require a coup d'etat against Makarios, who was the elected leader of Cyprus. It would require Greeks to kill Greeks. Because in order to impose to implement the Atchison plan, you would have to have gotten rid of Makarios, who was also excluded. The Cypriot government was excluded from the negotiations in Geneva. It were negotiations between the United States, covert negotiations also under the guise of UN talks, but they were actually talks between between Greece, Turkey, and the United States. I'm sorry? Did he visit Cyprus? I'm not sure if he did. He may have, but
Okay, let's move on perhaps to some other questions. Unless do you want to comment on this? Okay, gentleman over here, and then we'll go over there.
Thank you. Wayne Murray, the American Foreign Policy Council. I served at the American Embassy in Athens in the late 80s, so my perspective on Papandreou obviously comes much later than the period covered by your book. I'm to some degree, I suppose, reacting against the paragraph that was quoted at the end about Europe, because I'm bound to say that while Andreas may have talked a good European game, my very strong impression from those years was that he never really took Europe seriously, that he was always so America-centric that his government really was incapable of becoming a good European, good member of the EU. And that certainly I knew that my counterparts in European Union embassies deeply regretted that Karamanlis had not led Greece through the 80s because they regarded him as a good European, even a good Gaullist. But they looked at Papandreou as a man who, however he may be vilified by some people in Washington, was fundamentally America-centric and tended to regard Europe as a pot of money to be used for Greek domestic politics. And we saw some extraordinary statistics from the European Commission about the extent to which Greece violated European Union rules on levels that were literally orders of magnitude, thousands of times beyond that of any other country in the European Union, and that this and to some degree I dwell on this because it created European attitudes towards Greece as a European that persist to this day. For example, the current German finance minister, I know, got his fundamental distrust of the Greeks in the Papandreou years. The fundamental notion that these people are not good Europeans. They are not playing by the same rules as everybody else. And indeed, in the late 90s, countries like Slovakia and the Czechs and the Poles went out of their way to tell the European Commission, we are not going to be Greece. We're going to be like Portugal. We're going to be like Ireland. Don't worry, we're not going to be another Greece. I think sort of the irony is that, of course, his son then became, in my view, almost the best European prime minister Greece ever had, whether or not entirely wisely or not. But I suppose my final point is, it seems to me that in a sense, that in this great saga of Greece moving from being an American Cold War client state to its absolutely necessary destiny as a part of Europe, which is, seems from my point of view, the only rational road for Greece to take, what the Greece really needed was a center-left leader who was a good European, a Euro-socialist, if you will, but not somebody whose mind was still sort of in American academia. And I sort of give you that as a theory that, in a sense, the tragedy of Andreas Papandreou as the leader of Greece was his American background, which he never escaped. And what Greece really needed was a Karamanlis on the left.
Well, it had Kostas Simitis. Well,
Should I?
Go ahead.
well, no, I mean, I guess immediate reaction is, what about Kostas Simitis?
Well, Simitis was the first prime minister that the European Union ever regarded as a good European.
Well, he was the key figure in 1986. When Andreas made a major turn in his policy orientation, he was the
Minister of Finance.
Minister of Economic. as well.
Should I try? It's
Yes, go
I
ahead,
just
please.
because in a way, this is not in the book, right? So, but it's completely fine to talk about it. The reason I didn't talk too much about the populism, and I alluded to what you were talking about through the unintended consequences of bringing some American campaigning ideas to Greece. But when I talked about electoral cycles, for example, it's clear that Andreas was elected in 1981 with the idea, or with a chance at least, of EOC and NATO should go out of our country and the bases should be out. And of course, after he got elected, nothing of that sort happened, right? And frankly, almost you can find nowhere Andreas saying that. You can hardly find Andreas saying that, but his party was, like his popular base was actually chanting that, and the party was propagating that, but Andreas was not saying it, as far as I can tell, himself very explicitly. Maybe he was saying it in private. But he didn't do it regardless. It doesn't matter whether he was saying it or not. He didn't do it. And one reason he didn't do it is because that was a perfect situation for him. He could get money from developmental cohesion funds of the EU and, basically throw it into projects that would or would not work. He didn't, I don't think, personal opinion, I don't think he cared as much about whether the farmers of Crete would change their crops according to EU regulations. He cared that they voted for him the next time around. And we are forgetting, we're talking about a politician, right? And we're talking about a politician that really cared about being in power. And as the book actually does tell us, is he really thought that the only way you can bring change is to have as much power as possible. So he was really eager to get power. He was very good at doing that. And I alluded to the cleavage issues he did and how the party organization, he created the first mass party in Greece after the Communist Party, I guess. But the Communist Party was never able to get off the ground, really, because of external reasons and others. But he created the first governing mass party, let's say. And other parties emulated him. It's not just that Andreas was a patronage machine. Machine politics was introduced maybe by the rising sun, as my professor at the University of Athens called it, the rise of the Greek sun. But other parties also tried to emulate that. Nea Demokratia did not shy away from creating its own mass party in the 80s after Mitsotakis took the lead of the party. And it was not any better before. It was just a personalistic type of party where patronage would be done between, peoples going to their, constituents and directly exchanging things. And now it was more rationalized. It was more bureaucratized. It was more Weberian. And Andreas did it better. That's why he got reelected a few times. He got reelected after he had surgery, and he 47% of the vote in 1993. That's amazing. After having gone to court, after having been, it's just fascinating. I mean, and he had a great machine that he had created.
Thank you. Gentleman there. No, the other one before. No, this one.
Yeah, well, I'm neither European nor American, so
You're free.
I'm free. I happen to like Cyprus because I view Cyprus as Greece with British discipline. And I've been there quite a few times.
But you are losing.
Losing that discipline, I understand. My question is really on the issue of Hellenism. There is the Cyprus of Archbishop Makarios, and then there is the Cyprus of Enosis.
Of?
Enosis, this.
Enosis, yeah.
There was a renegade general whose name escapes me right now.
Grievous. Grievous, General Grievous, yes.
To the extent that Turkey partly, not wholly, but partly, used the idea of enosis as a reason or an excuse to invade Cyprus. And
As a reaction against the Greeks, you mean, yes.
I would like some clarifications on where did Andreas Papandreou stand on this issue of Makarios versus the enosis group.
He was very much.
I just also want to add a personal thing. I'm here because I was an undergraduate at Wesleyan when Andreas Papandreou came to address us, and I was mesmerized by the guy.
What's your name? Could you just introduce
My
yourself?
name is Vinod Basjit.
Okay, thank you. You want to take that one?
Well, he was a supporter of Makarios. He warned, as a matter of fact, what he saw, Grievous he saw as someone, as an ultra-nationalist, who was sort of unconsciously, as it were, serving the interests of those who wanted to partition Cyprus and incorporate it into NATO. No, he's very supportive of Makarios, and in that sense, his nationalism, you see, has a funny twist there, because the ultra-nationalists wanted Cyprus to be incorporated into Greece. Andreas wanted to remain independent. But he told us in Toronto often that 2 Greeces are better than 1.
2 votes at the UN Security Council. Security Assembly, sorry, not Council. We're not there.
Okay, yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Tom Miller. I was stationed in Greece 3 times in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. So I'm really looking forward to your next book, because that's the period that picks up on what I remember. I'm fascinated by comments by both of you about the father-son relationship. I don't know much about that. I do know a lot about the Andreas-George Jr. relationship, and if there were 2 people more dissimilar in Greek politics than those 2, I have yet to know who they are. And I'd like to get a comment, in our own politics, we look at George W. and we look at, kind of the reaction formation against the father, which a lot of people have speculated about. 2 questions. Number 1, I hope in your follow-up you will say something about this. I'd like to get your comments on how much this was a factor in Andreas's kind of formulative thinking in the early 60s, a strong father and kind of reaction against this. And any comments you might have about George Jr. and his reaction to a very, very strong father and him turning out, I can totally see where he's his mother's son. I have a real hard time seeing where he's his father's son.
Well, maybe I'll pick up George Sr., you can pick up George Jr.
Yeah. As a junior, yeah, I see.
Well, the role of Andreas' father in his own political presence and thinking, is that really what you want? I mean, it's a complicated story, obviously, and it is one of the key threads in the book. The relationship. It was a difficult relationship in this following sense. His father divorced his mother.
The age of 6, right?
The affair with Kiveli began,
Earlier,
but the divorce was in 23 or something. So yeah, Andreas was quite young.
4. Yeah.
Well, George Jr. was much older when and Andreas and Margaret split. But in any case, his father was a figure of awe to some degree, but also someone he had some bitterness about it because of the divorce. I can tell you anecdotally something that's not in the book. The one time I was in Andreas's home office, at his home, which is where you have a home office, I guess, there was one photograph on his desk. It was a photograph of his father. It wasn't a photograph with his family. It was a photograph of his father, almost an icon. He revered his father, and when Andreas was growing up, his father had a lot. He stayed with his father on weekends. They had political discussions. His father, a very important event in Andreas's early life, when Andreas was, I think, in 3rd or 4th grade, he was an unmanageable student at school and had to go into private home studies. And his father brought him in and sat him down and said, if you continue on this path, you'll amount to nothing. And it had Andreas was sort of overwhelmed by that. I mean, he reacted strongly to that, but he conformed to it. It was a change moment for him, and he came in first in his class the next year when he returned to school. Politically, I mean, that's personal background more or less sort of thing. Politically, the problem was, for Andreas, the main dividing point between them is that his father had become part of the Greek establishment. Although his father was a Republican, began as a Republican of Venizelos before the war, he, like all the rest of political elites, accepted the monarchy as an essential part of the scene. George Papandreou tried to push the monarchy to stop favoring the right and to consider the center legitimate. But Andreas was quite willing to go further, especially when the king overturned his father's government. He was more of a modernizer. He was maybe there's something to do with the American influence, but on the other hand, the Danish monarch was the model for Andreas of what the Greek monarch should be, someone who doesn't intervene in affairs of the country. Is that enough? I mean, does that give you?
I'll stay tuned for your.
Well, I also.
You could write a book about this, and it's something that's really, since I didn't really know much about the relationship between Andreas and George Sr. and saw this played out with Andreas and George Jr. It's fascinating to me, and
Could you tell us a story of where, like, a critical moment where you realized that tension?
Yeah, I mean, when George was a junior guy in the 80s, and he was appointed, I think his first
Education, maybe?
Education minister or deputy, actually.
And,
Yeah.
there were just numerous opportunities for Andreas, not in obvious, kind of very overt way to promote George, and he really didn't. I mean, he really kind of went out of his way to almost belittle George and humiliate him. And this was kind of, in the 80s, I had no contact. I knew George, but I had no contact with Andreas. When I was DCM, I had a lot more contact with Andreas up till the end, right when he died. But it was pretty common knowledge. George, whereas Mitsotakis was doing everything he could to promote Dora and then Pavlo Bakayani, I mean, that was kind of traditional Greek politics. And that was what was expected. But the idea that George kind of had to make it on his own and wasn't really seen as a son, as the favorite, Even talk at the time that Nikos, and Nikos in particular, was kind of more of the father's favorite. So it's just stuff that was that I picked up, and you never really saw, and all the time that I know George Jr., he rarely talks about his dad, really rarely. And the rest, I guess, I just intuit.
Yeah, I just wanted to see where you're coming from to see what's the most relevant type of answer you want, because there are the obvious internal workings of PASOK that are not probably of interest to you. But I think from a well, yeah. True. Well, PASOK is having some rough times, if you haven't noticed. But the point, or in Syriza. Yeah. The point is that I think there might be something for Stan to develop in his next book in what you're saying, in the sense that there's definitely, from my reading of this book, it's clear that there was definitely a traumatic, if you want, experience for Andreas. This eagerness of his father to bring him back is very well documented here, in the way, not to promote him necessarily in a unmeritocratic way, but to bring him back because he needed more people of his trust, I guess, George. So that's what it comes out, that he sent him letters, he asked him to go back. Andreas was very ambivalent, actually. I'm not aware of how George Jr., how ambivalent he was in getting into politics, or how eager he was. I've no clue about that. Okay, because Andreas was very ambivalent, but then when he decided to go in, it seems that he wanted to not be his father's son anymore, or not to be seen as his father's son, Andreas. And he actually resigned in a very dramatic way from the government, and although he had done it in collaboration with his father, in contact with his father, he definitely did it because he thought that in the public eye, that was not looking like a good strategy for him to be just his father's son, and so on and so forth. So what would be interesting to know is whether Andreas felt that George had to be like, George Jr. had to be like him and take the bull from his, however you say that, from his...
By the horns, right?
By the horns, I guess, okay. Whatever that idiom is. So whether he's going to take his own fortune in his hands, basically, and kind of, despite his father's wills or whims or whatever, he could do it on his own, and that way he wouldn't be accused by the fellow PASOK cadres as being a favorite or whatever. So maybe he was trying to spare him from a Mitsotakis moment from the 60s, right? That is described in the book, meaning having the internal people that would say, oh, no, you didn't. No, you're not going to do that, like father, like son kind of thing. So that's one way you could explain that. The other thing could be that Andreas was too self-absorbed at that point to even care. That's my hypothesis in a way. And I think he was so into hanging on to power and to, do whatever he thought he would do with that power, because history will judge him whether he did more good than the bad, that he probably didn't even put much time in this, which might say something in itself about what you're alluding to. But I don't know, Stan might have a lot more to say about this.
Let's take a couple of final questions because we're quickly running out of time. The gentleman, the red sweater there on the right, and then we'll, yeah.
My name is Walter Cole, and go Mr. Miller one better. I was 3 times at the American Embassy in Athens in the 60s and 70s. And the book about the 3 generations of Papandreous still has to be written. This one is the legacy of Andreas. The legacy always is judged by the finding of what benefits the nation got out of the work and life of that personality. And that is something I would ask. That is the question. The other things are more observations. I saw old George Papandreou walk out dramatically out of Parliament in probably 64, 65 or so. And that was an interesting time. I lived through Andreas's being minister to the prime minister. Was that his job?
That
I
was
think?
his first post.
Yes. And that was given to him by his father, Papandreou, and he owed him for that. But otherwise, what you said about the relationship was quite true. George, I think, redeemed Andreas in some way. Because I would say, as you more politely than I could said, this Andreas, American-educated economist surrounded by an American-born family, was not unsubstantial pain in the neck to the American embassy there while I was there. Maybe not while you were there anymore, but he was. And but he was seen at that time, and it's a long time ago. I live in Greece in the summer for the last 25 years or so. But he was seen at the time he was prime minister, and in the time that before the takeover by the colonels, as a man who had never overcome his relationship or being part of the American flower children culture. He was not in the beginning, and perhaps wrongly, not taken quite seriously. There are many of those years, the 60s, who never were able to leave it. They lived through other phases of their lives, still thinking that was it. Vietnam and all that was together with it. And so Andreas Papandreou was seen as one of those.
Okay.
The question now I have and come back to is, how beneficial was his rule to the nation that he ruled, and in connection with the current problem the nation undergoes. Strangely enough,
I have to bring you to an end now, sir.
A nation that is very good at finding scapegoats never blamed Andreas Papandreou for what they have to go through right now. And that surprises me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And if you could pass the microphone down to the lady here for the final question, and I'll give both.
Thank you. My name is Julia Panouria-Colonis, and quite related to this one, specifically excellent presentations about Andreas, but I think another parameter should be brought into focus, the environment through which when Andreas appeared in Greece. There are those who believe or they see Andreas as a response, as a personification of what the Greek society wanted to happen. So what Andreas' persona was formulated not only from the factors we also talked about, but from what the Greek society, the change the Greek society wanted. And I wonder your comments on this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Brief.
Well, brief response. I
Yes.
guess, I mean, I would say that Andreas, with all the positives and negatives, did manage the transition of Greece from a kind of its post-war status as a rather, as a semi-client state, particularly of the United States, to a modern European democracy. I mean, I think that is real for whatever that meant in both cases. I mean, when I say client state, it's not necessarily a negative. I mean, in terms of the fact that certainly the United States provided the economic means for Greece to recover, but there were costs also. That Greece has become a modern European democracy? Well, we'll see. We have to see if Europe will remain a modern European democracy.
All right, then.
Just two things only. We have 2 minutes. One thing is that Andreas was a true populist in that sense, going to Julia's question. He was a true populist in a sense that he did adapt to the local, but I think it was more interactive, and you're right to point out that there is an interaction. It wasn't just he was an American academic with liberal ideas and he came to implement them. He did transform partly because he had to campaign, right? And partly because he knew from the US experience that you take your constituencies seriously if you want to get elected in District 5 in Virginia or whatever, you need to listen to your people. So he had done campaigning. So there is an interaction. He had some mode of operandis, in his head, and then he went and did similar things in Greece. And when he went to Thessaly, you're describing this greatly he went to Thessaly to basically both get support from the agricultural farmers and all that, but at the same time to kind of get to feel the people. What we say, let's get a feel. Then they didn't have as many polls as we do every day, a poll about every decision. So he had to feel the people. And he did conform often, or he did change his mind or the way he would talk about certain things based on that. And he had a knack for feeling the people. So his Le Monde interview, for example, is an example of that sort, when he kind of sides with Makarios and says, well, if it needs to be with the Soviets, and the Soviets will bring peace there, maybe we need the Soviets. And that freaks out the Americans, but also makes him extremely popular at home. So it's a double action, I would think. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we've had a terrific lunch time conversation here. Thank you so much to Stan Draenos, and congratulations on the publication of your book. Thanks to Harris for wonderful comments. Thanks to all of you for joining us. We're adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.